Well, hey, good morning, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Unlocked. I'm your host, Tracy Wilson, and today I've got a really awesome guest for you guys. We've just been having a really great conversation behind the scenes. This is the amazing Jason Voiovich, and today he's going to share some really awesome insights into history. So we're going to kind of do a bit of a look around in our rear vision mirror to see what's gone on in history, in particular to do with the American presidents. So over the last, number of decades or centuries, in fact, there have been certain patterns, certain things that have gone on. And as I've read Jason's book, which we'll tell you a lot about in today's show, it's been really fascinating the way in which he actually put that together in understanding what's gone on in history and then actually making some correlations to what's going on today. I'm not going to spill the beans too much because I want to tell you a little bit about him first and give you a bit of his backstory. So he's got a career that actually spans more than 25 years. He's launched hundreds of products, everything from medical devices to virtual healthcare systems to non-dairy consumer cheese to next generation alternatives to the dreaded cone of shame for pets, that big thing that they put around their heads. My son only had one of them on his dog the other day, thanks to you, Jason. And also the sex aids for cows. You want to say, what, really? Sex aids for cows? Yep, really. And he's also a graduate of both of the University of Wisconsin and the University of Minnesota, where he's completed his postgraduate studies at the MIT Sloan School of Management. His formal training has been absolutely invaluable, but he actually credits his true success to growing up in a family of artists, immigrants, and entrepreneurs. And they taught him how to carefully observe the world, see patterns before others actually notice them, and use those insights to create new innovations. And Jason's favorite way to observe the world, he believes, is from actually looking back in the past, because that has plenty to teach us about the challenges and the new opportunities that we actually face today. So today's conversation is going to be packed jam full of I suppose history, but also looking at that history and how we're actually seeing a lot of history actually play out again in the world that we are in today. So, we might go down a few little rabbit holes from time to time, but I'm also going to say to Jason, I can thank he and his family for many calories that have been put on my hips over many years because I just happen to love Neapolitan ice cream. Now, I'm not going to tell you too much more about that because I'm sure Jason will tell you about his family history and why the heck I'm blaming he for a number of calories that have been put on my hips over a number of years. So thanks very much. I love Neapolitan ice cream.
You are welcome. Thank you for having me, Tracy. It's such a pleasure to be here and talk with you. And yes, it was my family's fault. I have a grandfather who invented Neapolitan ice cream. I had a grandfather on my wife's side who invented the bazooka in World War I. I have another grandfather on my mother's side, and they emigrated from Cuba in the 1960s to the United States, and they invented disposable coffee filters, and they manufactured those. So it's a variety, and that's not even scratching the surface. My father was an artist, a creative director, a madman. If you've ever watched the show Mad Men, I grew up thinking that was normal. Just if that gives you any sense for what kind of a person I am, it's you watched Don Draper, you watched that was childhood for someone like me. So no, I it's what's interesting. What I love about history really is in product development, in communication, in leadership, we face so many challenges. There's so many new things. We have so much coming at us all the time that it sometimes can feel really overwhelming that we need to come up with these answers all on our own all the time. And what I learned early on and what my parents and my family taught me was, boy, if you read carefully, other leaders have faced similar situations. What could you learn from them? What could you learn from someone who handled a situation like that? And what could you do differently? What could you do the same? How could you adapt that? So I don't feel like I'm alone, that I have to figure out all these things by myself. I've got hundreds of people whose wisdom I can call on if I just know where to look.
Absolutely. And I, how, what an exciting thing for you, and how lucky are you to have grown up in a family like that, that has just, instilled in you, and clear that has been, passed down through the genes for generations, that you've just got the innovation gene, and that thirst for continuous learning and development. But also, like you say, looking back into history and saying, well, what can I see there that could actually help me navigate my way around maybe some challenges, but also some opportunities that exist
Right.
today. So I want to ask you this question first. Like, you've clearly, like having that list of all sorts of different developments and innovations that you have been in. Like, how do you, firstly, we'll get to the book side of things in a minute, but
Yeah.
from a because right now in society, right, we've got, like, I think about the number of people that are being displaced in their jobs. And so a
Right.
lot of them are now thinking about, and I think I read something yesterday that in the United States alone, it's something like 40, I have this written down, 41 odd percent of people are actually looking to quit their job and start something anew, or they've been displaced because they
Right.
don't, kind of going along with the current narratives, and they don't want to play along with those, so they want to create something for themselves. So for someone like you, when you talk about, I'm not alone, I can actually look at history or look at other people and see what did they do to help me create my new future, and how do I innovate in the world that I'm in now. What pieces of advice could you give to people today that are in that kind of situation? What would you suggest they do right now?
I think that the biggest thing I see when people are being displaced, and that's not just happening in the United States, it's we in the United States tend to have a bias to things happening in the United States. But when you take a broader look and you start to see, well, what's happening in China right now? What's happening in Australia, in your area of the world? What's happening in Africa? What's happening in South America? What you realize is that the economies are changing, that people's expectations are changing, that there is new technology coming at us very, very quickly. And sometimes that can feel really overwhelming. I think the best piece of advice I could give people is read books about the 1920s. Let me explain why I say that. Okay.
Uh-huh.
When we think about the 1920s, we think, oh, that's, the hairstyles, the on Downton Abbey. You ever watch Downton
Mhm,
Abbey? They
mhm.
had, towards the end of that show, there was the Downton Abbey movie, and they all had hairstyles in the 1920s, and they had, the dancing was cool, and it was the roaring 20s, and it was all this excitement. What people forget is when you take a look at all the list of innovations and change that happened during the 1920s. Let's just name a few. The automobile, obviously.
Mhm,
The airplane. Okay,
mhm.
just think about those two things. That's it. If that was the end of the list, that would be transformative, but it wasn't. Radio, television was invented during that time. The electric razor, the refrigerator, the dishwasher. Uh, you could name 50 or 60 different innovations that happened. Quantum theory was invented in the 1920s. So when we think about, oh gosh, who has lived through this kind of transformational change before? Everyone who lived in the 1920s had to. If you were born, if you took a person from the 1950s and you brought them to today, someone from the 1950s would be able to figure out our world pretty easily. Okay, they'd be able to, well, okay, you drive, you have a refrigerator, you go out to restaurants. Okay, I got all that. Things would be like, okay, I'm looking at a computer right now. The computer has a keyboard on it that doesn't look that different than a typewriter, does it? I mean, fundamentally, not that different. If you took someone from 1900 and brought them to 1950, the world would be completely unrecognizable. Absolutely 100% unrecognizable. They would not know how to process it. There are so many new things. So when I think about blockchain, I think about artificial intelligence. I think about climate technologies and innovations that are coming with climate science, renewable energy, all of those things. And people say, oh, it's just so overwhelming. I can't keep up with everything that's happening with cryptocurrencies. You can figure that out. Back in the 1920s, we worked through that period, and you can learn how people reacted, how they changed. When you start to think that, hey, just the understanding that someone else made it through that, they figured out, there was no home mortgage in the United States before the 1920s. That was when it was invented, that entire kind of, that you'd buy a home using a 30-year mortgage. That didn't exist before. Think about that. All those things, think about how transformative it was. You see how people adapted to that. You know what? We can figure out blockchain. We can figure out these sort of things. We'll get through it. No problem.
So essentially what you're saying, Jason, like when we look at history, like we're not talking about things that we do that is necessarily a quantum leap. These things happen. It's an evolution, and they happen, bit by bit over time. And as they roll out, and we as humans, we're pretty smart creatures, right? We get to adapt. We learn how to adapt to the new environment, and it doesn't always happen. Like you say, it's not like taking somebody from the 1800s and transporting them into today's world and saying, well, now live like you would try and figure out today's world. Right. No, it's that there is a slow evolution and things unfold over time. But what you are saying, like when I read the book and I've looked at a lot of the literature that you've put out, it's chunking things down. And when we start to understand that things happen almost like in bite-sized pieces, is the way that I would like to put it, that it makes it much easier to comprehend, to understand, and it becomes a lot less overwhelming because it doesn't feel like it's this massive quantum leap that I've got to try and take everything on board all in a really short space of time. I also loved, like, one of the things that I wanted to talk about, like when we think about marketing and advertising, let's talk about that as a concept firstly, and maybe even give people a little bit of a understanding of the difference or the marriage between the two of those. How do they marry together, and what is the difference between the two of those? Because I think marketing and advertising, like, is always been there. It's this concept of that we've got on the screen here, relationships, pricing, value propositions, product development, and then how do we actually persuade people to actually take on board the new thing that we're creating? So let's give everybody a little bit of an insight into that, because I love how you explain that.
I think the way I found the easiest way to explain it to people is advertising is a part of marketing. And it not the other way around. I like to think of it like an iceberg. And of an iceberg metaphor, advertising is the piece that you see above the waterline. That's the thing that everyone pays attention to and that gets all the attention. What you really don't realize is that there's a huge amount of marketing that happens beneath the scenes. That's how the product is designed. How does the product work? How is it priced? How do you get it? Do you buy it on Amazon? Do you buy it in the physical store? Do you get it online? All of those different things contribute to the message that you see at the top. So when you're starting to think about the difference between marketing and advertising, it's why I called it marketer in chief and not advertiser in chief, because there are so many things that come into what it takes to market an idea or market a product. That's a lot more than just the message. That, this isn't, I didn't want to write a book about campaign literature and the persuasive strategies of one candidate versus another candidate. We touch on that in the book here and there. But really what's so much more interesting, just like you said, Tracy, is when you kind of dip beneath the waterline and you start to see why something works. That's when it gets really exciting. And that's where all the lessons come. All the things you can take away are under the waterline.
And I love this concept, like you just alluded to that there. The reason that you called the book itself Marketer in Chief and not Advertiser in Chief, but also the fact that you sort of looked at the presidents of America and said, well, what if we actually looked at them through a completely different lens? What if we looked
Right.
at them rather than being the chief executive officer of a country? What if I actually looked at them as the marketing officer of a country, the marketer in chief of that
Right.
country, and then we can make this correlation. Like as I was reading it, I'm making the correlation between, all right, so I'm reading this. It's about U.S. presidents, and for a lot of people that might be outside of the US, you might think, well, why would I want to read a book like that? And to be honest, I mean, I'm from New Zealand. I now live in Australia. I'm interested in my own history. Why the heck would I want to read a book about American history? But the point is that when you do start to read it and you start to understand and you can see, what these presidents did and what the patterns were, and then you start thinking about it from a entrepreneurial and a business perspective, that gives you a much deeper, I suppose, insight and connection with the information that you are reading. So as I was reading, I just wanted to make that point because I think a lot of people, particularly those of us that are outside of the United States, might think, well, why would I want to learn that? But it's actually really fascinating when you do, and you come at it from that perspective. When you come at it from, you are an entrepreneur, you are a business owner right now, and we're all needing to navigate this world that we now live in. And like Jason said earlier, a lot of the history and the history books that have been written actually give us some really good insight and some really good wisdom in the way in which we can start navigating our way through the challenges and the obstacles, but also how we can look at new opportunities that we may also be faced with too, because I think there's a lot of those.
I
So
think so. Yes.
yeah. So inside of the book, like I was going through and you were talking about kind of these six different, what would we call them? Like communication styles, or the way in which we adapt to things. And
Yeah.
you've categorized each of the presidents in this way. So I want to sort of unpackage those six, you know, ways in which you've categorized them because they are very, very relevant to business today. And I want to ask our listeners now, as we start to unpackage these, I want you to think about it from a perspective of which are you? Which one of these categories, as a business owner and as an entrepreneur, do you actually fit into in this moment in time? And are you somebody who is constantly adapting? Are you somebody that is evolving? Because I think maybe even though in the book and in the way in which you've summarized the book, that you've categorized everybody in this way, but I would like to say that I think people continue to evolve and they develop, and maybe we actually move through each one of those, those different categories over time. So let's start with innovators. Let's kind of unpackage this concept of innovator. And when I go back and I looked at the book, the ones that stood out for me, there were a couple, but we'll start with George Washington because you'd already mentioned this. You brought up the subject of cryptocurrency,
Right.
Bitcoin, and the like. And if we go back and firstly kind of unpackage what does it mean to be an adapter, why did you put George Washington in that category? And what was it that he did about currency that made him fit into that category as an innovator?
I think Washington's an interesting case. When we think about the United States of 1780s, people think, oh, it's 1776. The Declaration of Independence was signed, and poof, we have a fully formed constitutional republic, and things are happening. That's not actually the case. That's not actually what happened. You had to fight a war, you had to win the war, and you had to write a constitution afterwards. It very much in the way I structure the book is around how a new product enters the marketplace and it evolves over time.
Mm.
There is no real difference. The point I make is that there's no real difference between a product innovating in a marketplace and evolving, and an idea. Products are just ideas with some physical wrapping around them. That's really all they are. You're really buying an idea. And what's interesting about George Washington is one of the first things he faced wasn't, kind of the war and all of those things. It was really, most people don't know this, in the 1780s, the most popular currency in the United States was a Spanish peso. And the reason people used it was ubiquitous. It was everywhere. And each state even had their own currency. The federal government had its own currency, the continental, and there were Spanish pesos, or you bartered with other people. What Washington realized is that to tie the country together and to finance, to pay the war debt, it needed to have a currency. Well, what's the idea behind money? When we think about, well, what is money? Well, is money coins? Is it dollar bills? Is it banknotes? Really, money is simply the belief that your government will have the ability to, you'll be able to exchange that dollar bill for some item of value somewhere else. If you don't have that, if people don't believe that and they can't make that exchange, well, there's no real reason to believe that that money has any value. So at its core, money is just about belief. And what Washington did is, through Congress and through Alexander Hamilton and other people, put the structure in place so that people would believe that the currency was worth what it was printed on. Mm-hmm. Unless you do that, unless you figure out that connection to belief, unless you really sell people that idea, the rest of it doesn't really matter. What's funny, the story I like to relay about that in a very tangible way is that the first US dollars were essentially knockoff pesos. They were essentially, they looked the same, they were structured the same, they were about the same weight, the whole deal, because Alexander Hamilton and George Washington realized that it would be easier for them to change a little bit than to adopt some totally new currency that they had never seen before. This one just looked like a different sort of peso, and it was extremely popular and it caught on. That's what we're talking about with belief. And really, when we talk about innovation, that really early stage stuff, it's all about how you're selling that idea to people who do not believe you and who do not think. Like, for instance, when we talk about an Elon Musk, for instance, did anyone believe that, when his first car wasn't the Tesla Model S, it was that little Roadster. No one believed at the time that, hey, that Hertz, the rental car company, would buy 100,000 of them to basically remake its rental fleet to be completely electric. No one believed him. He had to create that from an idea that we should electrify vehicles. Kind of an old idea, actually, but to commercialize it against huge competition, against no one who believed him. And now Ford just decided, and GM just decided, big automakers have decided, we're going to go electric within 10 years. We're not going to, other than just a few gas models, we're going electric.
And I think, when you look at the communication that was required at that time, like it with George Washington and even with the likes of Elon Musk, I mean, that all came down to one thing: trust, right? And having to build this, to build the amount of communication around that to get a society, to get a country, to get your audience, let's call it that, because it didn't matter, right. In anything we do, you've got to understand, who the heck am I talking to, which is, your audience. So whether you're the president, whether you're Elon Musk, he was speaking to a very specific audience in order to get them to understand the new thing and understand how it was going to be, see the vision, but also trust that it was just so. Like you say, we trusted that piece of paper that we got, because that's literally all it is, that we trust that it's actually got some weight, it's worth something, and that I can actually exchange it for what it's worth. So I think, when I look at these things, it's trust. And And because you'd mentioned earlier, and this is something that is, a hot topic right now around Bitcoin and crypto, and obviously we had all of the early adopters like, yeah, I'm seeing the vision, I see it right now. They jumped in, and then over time, you get, you might get a few more people, and we look at the bell curve with all of that.
Right.
But again, it's about trust, right? So we want to make sure that people are sitting back, and not only with Bitcoin, you're also seeing this even with, is it to say, vaccinations. You've got those early adopters who are like, yep, I'm in, give it to me. And then there's the others that go through various stages of, I require some more level of information to get me to the point where I actually trust that what you're telling me is actually true and is going to be okay for me. So it's interesting when we kind of start to unpackage these presidents and their communication styles and the things that actually went on. And I know that in the book you're only looking at very specific kind of
Right.
moments in time, and everything has its time and its place, and there's context around it. But I think you've done this really beautifully in being able to understand what went on back then, what the opportunities are now, and what's actually going on today. The other thing that I do want to say is, and I mentioned this at the beginning with Jason, so when we were off screen, that a lot of people are unsettled right now. And what's great about what you've done is that it can give people a sense of, I'm going to say, comfort, security, to know that this is a moment in time, that we will move through what's going on right now, whatever that might be for you, and we will have something else new come in its right time. So that's one really great thing that we can take away from the history, from the history books for today, is that this is just a moment in time and it will pass. The other thing that I noticed, like when we're talking about innovators, so let's just for a moment, I want to explain what Jason means by an innovator. So in the book, he talks about an innovator being the people that are the risk takers. They are plain risk takers, plain and simple, right? So they there's no data, there's no precedent, there's no safety net for these guys. They're the ones that kind of burn the boats. Let's go. We're moving in that direction, and there is no way back. Every decision is their first decision. In each case when we're looking at from a presidential point of view, the ones that are paving a new way, they're paving the way forward. They're creating a new identity where nothing existed before. So for some of you guys that are listening today, you might actually be in that innovative phase. So we're going to call it a phase because you're creating something brand new, something that's never been done before. Maybe you're developing a brand new company that there's no rule books, there's no systems, procedures, processes. So a president that you could go back and look at would be somebody like the George Washington in America, George Washington, John Adams, and even looking at people like, or some movements that have been going on, like Black Lives Matter, or even with the likes of Greta Thunberg, who's gone out and they've actually starting to pave the way or shaking things up. So just, look at some of those people if you're in that phase of business or life right now where you're actually in the innovation phase. The next one I wanted to look at was like this concept of early adopters. And we've sort of segued into this, I think, because we've spoken a little bit about those people that, are ready to jump in, that the early adopters, they're ready to take on something new that's just been brought out. So let's give everybody a little bit of a backstory or insight into what do we mean by an early adopter? What sort of person is that?
An early adopter, and a lot of this, if you're really interested in a ton more just on the kind of theoretical side, it was Ev Rogers in the 1960s came up with this idea called the diffusion of innovations. And if you're an entrepreneur and you've looked at the bell curve of innovation from innovator, early adopter, early majority, this is what we're talking about here. It's all about psychology. People think it's about technology and it's about, okay, well, what new technical innovation in Bitcoin is there going to be? It's not really that at all. And what you're getting at, Tracy, is the psychology that changes over that time. And what we mean is these are people who are still taking risks, but they're not blazing a completely new trail. They are when, for instance, when people ask, well, who came up with the idea for McDonald's, the restaurant? And they ask,
Hmm.
well, it was Ray Kroc who
Hmm.
came up with the. No, actually, it wasn't. It was the McDonald's brothers who came
Hmm.
up with the idea for McDonald's. They had a couple of restaurants in Southern California, and it was Ray Kroc who looked at that and said, "You guys figured out. You guys innovated. I'm going to take it to the next step. I'm going to take that good idea and I'm going to start to make something with it." For the entrepreneurs and the innovators in your audience, you might be seeing that, okay, well, it's not a brand new idea. I'm taking something that someone has already thought of, but not a whole lot of people are buying yet. And I want to jump in right when I start to see that curve take off. That's what an early adopter is. They're risk takers, but they're a little bit more careful. They're waiting to make sure that that something's real before they jump on.
It's almost like we're on the cliff. You jump first, and if you survive and you pop up under that deep water, then I'll give it a go. But I might do a backflip while I'm doing it too, right? So I look pretty
I
cool as
love that.
as I do it. So that's kind of how I would I look at the analogy that I would use for these early adopters. It's kind of like I'm seeing somebody else has done it. How can I take what they've done, make it better, faster, stronger, whatever I need to do? How do I actually just innovate on that and make it a little bit better? And then use that as my opportunity. And I think in every um, at any moment in time, there are opportunities for us to do that. And sometimes, when we look back again in history, there's often people who have gone out and maybe things haven't gone as well as they should have. Maybe they failed. And a lot of that doesn't always come down to the thing that they were creating was not great. It was just the timing was off, that the market wasn't ready for it. And then you might look at those and go, well, actually, now's the time for me to bring something up like that out. Now's the time for me to bring forth that particular idea, maybe tweak it, innovate on it a little bit, and bring it back to the market. So, I wanted today's show to really give people the opportunity, because there are so many people looking for what's my next move, what do I need to do next, that this actually gives you the opportunity to maybe look at some history, look at what's been done before, and then think about how can you innovate on that, and is the timing right for you to be able to enter the market with something new, which is quite a cool thing to do, because you don't have to start from scratch then. The next did you want to add something to that? Sorry, Jace.
No, I think it's excellent. I think a lot of entrepreneurs sometimes think that they have to come up with this brand new idea. That if they see something else out in the marketplace, they Google it and they say, well, someone else has already done that particular thing. I need to keep looking to find my idea. Well, really, you don't have to start at the very beginning. It is completely okay to see the kind of mess that happens, see what sorts out. A lot of people have been doing that with cryptocurrency, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
They've been looking at, there's been so many different things. They've kind of crashed and burned. I think there was a Squid Game NFT that just
Yeah.
came out and it lost 99% of its value in a day. That's still a hallmark of an innovative market. Once
Mm-hmm.
you start to get to the point where that sort of thing doesn't happen anymore, there might be a lot of different coins and a lot of different NFTs out there, but there's starting to be a little bit of predictability. The mainstream market hasn't caught on, but it's not this complete wild west. Well, I use that metaphor in the United States. We know what that means. It means kind
Mm-hmm.
of
We know
untamed
what it means
wilderness.
too.
I suppose you Aussies know what that is as well.
Yeah.
Maybe it's not an outback sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's it's on the coast. You figured it out. That's what's if there could be any advice I give to entrepreneurs, you don't have to pick being an innovator. You could pick that next stage of the market psychology, which is all about early adopters. It's a little bit safer, but there's still plenty of opportunity there.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. All right. So the next phase in war, the category that we look at is the concept of the early majority. So this is again, if we use that analogy of I'm standing on the cliff, good old JC's jumped off. He's he's the innovator. He's gone and he popped up, and then Trace comes along and she wants to jump off their turn. I'm going to do a few back flips and what have you. And then we've got this whole, team of people behind us that say, well, they did it. I'm gonna give it a go too. I'm ready to take the plunge as well. So let's talk a little bit about this early majority, and like Jason said, what we're doing today is really thinking about the psychology and understanding how we as humans really how we behave, and how you can use that to your advantage when it comes to understand or innovating, developing, and creating a new opportunity for yourself in this current environment. So let's talk a little bit about this early majority.
I think the story I like to tell about the early majority is when I was a kid, the microwave oven was becoming a mainstream sort of thing. When I was a little kid, when I was born, the microwave, the psychology around people buying microwaves was still innovator early adopter. They were expensive, they were kind of hard to use, but you could still get one. It wasn't quite a brand new invention, but it certainly wasn't anything that the average family had. When you take a look at that early majority sort of piece, that's the part of that bell curve that is going steeply upward. And what's happening there is the majority of people are looking at the innovators, they're looking at the early adopters, and you're starting to get that kind of mass market, that mass psychology going. It's becoming trendy, it's becoming a thing. So when business owners and entrepreneurs look at markets like that, you've got to get in. And that's a case where it's not about creating a brand new idea. It's not even figuring out kind of where in the early stages you want to be. You need to be ready to move and respond to that kind of market demand, because it is growing really, really, really fast. And who wins there are the ones that can really take advantage of that scale. And that's where, if you're careful and you do it well, you can grow very quickly, very fast. But if you're not careful and you don't have the kind of infrastructure in place, you're not treating your employees well, you have a culture that's not working, you have a supply chain that is under stress. Have we seen any of those things happen right now? Absolutely, we have. If you're in an early majority market where it is growing fast, 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 and you have any of those problems, it can completely ruin what you had in mind. And this is what happened to the United States during that time. The leaders that were present during that time in the early majority, all of the things that didn't get solved, all of those kind of nasty issues that just didn't get addressed during the earlier stages, came to roost when the country grew, doubled, tripled, quadrupled in size over the course of 20, 30 years. That's when the United States went through the Civil War. It was because it didn't happen, that those issues weren't handled. We see this in companies too, right, Tracy?
Absolutely.
That companies that are growing really fast, Tesla went through this. We use them as an example again. Tesla went through exactly this when it couldn't get batteries, it couldn't get the supply chain, it promised the Model 3 and had a whole bunch of people go out and pre-order the car, and then couldn't deliver on it in time. And yes, it figured out, Elon Musk and team figured out how to get past that, but that was a very rocky period in Tesla's history, and it has happened again and again with companies as they grow fast. If there's something wrong, if there's a skeleton in the closet, that skeleton comes out and starts knocking heads.
And given my background being in finance, I mean, I saw loads of businesses go bust because they actually grew too fast. It's actually one of the major reasons that most businesses actually fail, is because they don't have the infrastructure, they don't have the support systems in place to actually support their rapid growth. Exactly. And so they're jumping up and down thinking it's happy days, when behind them it's like, oh my gosh, there's this massive mass destruction left in its trail. And if they either had to have deep pockets to be able to fill the gaps, and if you didn't have that, well, bankruptcy was usually what was looming pretty near, or they had to make some pretty swift moves to get themselves back on track. So it can be a very tumultuous time for people if they're not very, very careful. Some of the what's quite interesting is, like, when I looked at the presidents that you looked at in this particular category, being the early adopters, and we talk about again, where you categorize this being the early adopters, the majority presided over a period of rapid growth and expansion, and like most new innovations, any problems that they could sweep under the carpet or sweep under the rug early often burst into full view further down the track. And you just mentioned that with the skeletons in the closet, they come out, and they can actually threaten you and derail the entire thing. The presidents that stood out to me was obviously Abraham Lincoln, and he tried to get around that, obviously, by trying to diffuse a lot of situations. Lucky for him, he had a bit of humor on his side, so he could use that to try and win people over, right? Some of the presidents or prime ministers of today don't necessarily have that skill up their sleeve. And the other is Grover Cleveland, who also was used. It was trying to control a lot of, I suppose, the country's people by giving companies the opportunity to be able to control people's lives. And we're kind of seeing that in today with like data, and data giving companies what we would call power, big data, giving people power of today. And we're seeing a lot of pushback around that. So it's quite interesting, again, when you go back in this history and we look at some of those various different presidents and we see what's gone on. And then you can actually see, like, if you're not in favor of some of those things, maybe you might want to go and have a look at and see what some of the people did to overthrow or overcome some of those challenging times. The next is this group 4, which is the late majority. And you talk about this being during the late majority, businesses and nations can do whatever they set their mind to. If they made it through the challenges of rapid growth, then the only limitation is really their imagination. And this is what you guys saw, well, what the United States had, the kind of the good old days, or seen as like the place to be, the land of opportunity. So you guys went through a lot of that, and let's talk a little bit about the late majority and how that applies to business today. And I know that you've got a number of different presidents that you put into this category, and there's a couple that I've kind of pulled out as being I suppose ones that are familiar to me is probably the ones that I've pulled out, right? But also the ones that when you summarize them and you made some correlation to what's gone on today, I kind of pulled them out as well, because I'm like, I'm seeing a pattern here. I'm seeing that go on today. I wonder what they did, and it sort of piqued my curiosity. So William McKinley was one that you had in your book that you spoke about, and he's talked about the media. Way back then it was, and don't quote me on the time. I mean, Jace would know more about the dates and times because I got no clue. But I could just talk about the particular person and the instance that he speaks about in the book. And you were talking about how back when William McKinley was in charge, that this was the first time that he had to really try and use, I suppose, the journalists and media to try and sway the opinions of the people. But also he was saying, journalism and the media is not neutral ground. That's actually incorrect. And we're kind of seeing a lot of that in today's times, right?
I think what's important to understand about journalism in the United States and globally in many cases is that journalism is a business. There are a few places, the BBC in the UK is publicly funded, but they're not all that way. In most places in the world, the journalism has a profit motive. It needs to make money. It needs to reach an audience. And what happened around that time was called the yellow journalism era in our history, and there are similarities around the world where it was very partisan. It was very point of view. The same sort of thing, the right and the left that we see today in our media, is exactly what we saw then. Really, very much the same thing. And it was the media that helped kind of goad William McKinley into war with the Spanish in the Spanish American War. They made a really big deal out of the sinking of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor in Cuba. Whether or not that was an accident or not, the newspapers at the time made it into this terrible event that we needed to avenge. And William McKinley was caught really flat-footed in the beginning. He didn't really understand kind of the power that the media had to shape public opinion. Once he realized it, though, and once that crisis was passed, he started to court the media. He started to make sure that he had a media strategy. He was the first president that had a specific media strategy. And we've been living with the result of that over 120 years now, that leaders figured out that the media was critical. We needed to cultivate that strategy so that the leaders could use the media to help communicate their agenda. That was the first time we really saw it as a strategy that leaders of those types of organizations could face. And really, that's the same idea here, right? That every large organization that is at the top of its game absolutely has a media strategy. They know what kind of image they want to project into the market, and they are very strategic about it. And this is where, when you have that kind of market presence in Amazon, a Walmart, an Alibaba, a Mitsubishi, Hyundai, Samsung, any of these global organizations at the top of their game absolutely cultivate global media all the time. They have to, because they know how integral it is to maintaining their dominance and to help communicate this kind of grand vision of what they want to do. And that was the same thing with McKinley, and it's the same thing that leaders in the corporate world took the lesson to heart, and they're still doing it today.
Absolutely. I mean, and even, if you can't get the attention of the big, of the journal, the media, the mainstream media, then what do? These days we've got the likes of social media, and even as a smaller, if you're a smaller entrepreneur, what do? They've twigged onto the fact that they also need to be able to use media as a way of being able to get their information out. We see that in the shape and form of influencers, and so that's where we have the influencer marketing come to the forefront, where we're starting to who are the big players that can influence decision making, persuade people to buy certain things. So we'll go and find them, and we'll try and get some airtime on their in their space to promote whatever it is that we're doing for today. And so what's quite interesting about this is that we mustn't forget that the media is it's a for-profit organizations, and they will often obviously speak the party line that's going to pay the bills. So it's often not always it's not neutral ground. We're not always seeing both sides of the story, depending on who's paying the bills in that situation. So anyway, we'll digress. We'll come back to center. We digressed a little bit there, but just a couple of little points to make, in today's and what we're seeing today. And like Jason has said, this has gone on for many decades, right way back to William McKinley, when he was the president of the United States, when he realized that, hey, I need to get the media on board and get them to help me to persuade the peoples that I'm actually doing the right thing. Anyway, let's get back on track. So group number 5, the laggards. So the laggards are still command respect in the market. They are not unbeatable. Usually a high-profile loss is a turning point. And in the USA, we saw that with the resignation of President Nixon some years ago. Some of the people that I've put into this category, or that you've put into this category, that were obviously ones that I remember, the Jimmy Carters, the Ronald Reagans of the time, and even George H.W. Bush. So let's kind of unpackage, the Legos. How do we put that into, make the correlation in today's world? What are we seeing today that is actually going on?
This is a different kind of psychology. It's a different sort of organization here that is clearly still important in the marketplace. If you think about Tesla as this innovative, out there brand, you could think about like a General Motors as a laggard type organization, one that just isn't quite what it used to be. Its best days might have been behind it. It can still, it can still sell a lot of cars. It can still sell a lot of trucks. It can still do great things. There are great things that were accomplished in the United States, from Nixon, Ford, Carter, Reagan, Bush, Clinton, kind of in that era. It's not that great things couldn't happen. It's that the United States was no longer completely in control of everything that was happening. The United States could be beaten. And that's a really different sort of thing. And you look at organizations that run into that situation as well, where, Tesla's on the coming up, and it's kind of, you can't beat them right now. But General Motors, Ford, Chrysler, Opel, Fiat, name those kind of global brands. Well, they're all struggling. They're on the backslide of that curve. And it can be a very stressful time to leave. Many of your folks who are entrepreneurs on the side might be working inside an organization that is clearly past its prime, and it's stressful. It can be difficult to innovate in an organization like that because, boy, what was happening, what made you money 10 years ago is just not making you money anymore. The classic example, of course, is Kodak.
Yes.
Where what made them money, essentially film, for film cameras. Well, when digital cameras came out, there was an overlap there. If you remember, you could buy a film camera and a digital camera. The digital cameras for a long time weren't as good. I remember going on photo shoots early in my career where the photographer would shoot some early drafts on a Polaroid, and maybe do that. He replaced his Polaroid at first with a digital camera just to do the basic framing and lighting. But he would always go to the film camera to do the final shots. Well, by the time, about 10 years later, he had gotten rid of all of the film cameras. The Polaroids, all the Kodak film was gone, and it was completely 100% digital, no separate cameras. It had all changed. The gotcha is, if you're not making the changes during that time, though, your days are numbered. And you need to be thinking about, how do you disrupt that? How do you find some new thing to kind of reinvigorate the organization to put it back on a growth trajectory, kind of re-innovate? Because every idea, every product has a life cycle. We see it again and again and again. They kind of go through that curve. Well, at the end, you have an opportunity up there where you've got all that capital because you're selling a lot of products, you're selling a lot of services. You've got that capital to invest in something new. Most organizations, just the psychology of people in those organizations, is it's so much more risky to go back and be George Washington again than to be Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton just isn't as risky, but you have to reinvent. Because if you don't, eventually just on a slow decline. Kodak is still around, but who's buying a Kodak camera today? Maybe a hobbyist.
A novel, somebody who
it's a novelty.
Oh, it's a novelty, exactly.
Right.
The kids might buy them, like my granddaughter. Well, this is a bit fancy. Look at this, but it is just a novelty,
right?
And we're seeing that, this innovation. I mean, that's why you look at the likes of Apple, that's constantly innovating. They're always bringing out something new because they need to stay top of people's mind, stay in the game, and keep their product relevant in the time in which they are in. Otherwise, you become stale, and all of a sudden, you become the BlackBerry. For those of you
That's
that
right.
might remember having a BlackBerry, that is no longer, no longer. I don't even know if they're still around now, or if it's certainly not common, or popular these days. People have moved on from that. And then there's the sixth category that we will be able to close on today, which is the disruptors. And we are clearly in a very disruptive
Right.
environment right now, and most, and we probably have been for, well, in your guys, in the American case, probably for the last, what, maybe four or five presidents, have been in that space of disruption. So let's talk a little bit about that, and how it applies to, from a presidential point of view, but also applies to, business today and entrepreneurship.
If you think, you brought up Apple as an example, and it's an incredible example of an organization that in the late 70s, early 80s was clearly on that growth path and had clearly kind of peaked and was starting a slow decline. And what the board did at that time is they brought back Steve Jobs. They essentially brought
Mm,
back George Washington to
mm,
come back in and innovate again. And that's what should give people hope, is that when you bring in that energy again and you rethink it, would anyone today think Apple is less innovative than they were when they invented the Apple II, and the Macintosh? Not at all. Think of the transformation that's happened in that second wave. Think of
mm,
the iPad, the iPod, the iPhone, the watch, Apple Pay. Think of all those innovations, and I'm leaving out a dozen of them that are important. There's a lot of hope there. And what we see in the United States now over the last series of presidents, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, Joe Biden, has all been about, what is that new idea going to be? It's almost like, we're going back and we need that George Washington type figure again to provide a new vision for what that next curve is going to look like. And it's really when I think about, okay, well, so many people can feel really negative right now about all the things that are going on, and I'm not. And the reason I'm not is there's so much opportunity. It doesn't have to be a decline. It doesn't have to be Kodak. It can be Apple. There's no reason it can't be, but it takes leadership and it takes
mm.
vision. And that's my standard for a leader in a disruptive time, whether it's an Obama, a Trump, a Biden, or whoever comes next, or whatever corporate leader we're talking about, is, do you have the vision to take the organization to that next step? It takes kind of bold, strong, visionary leadership that's positive, that people can get behind. And you may argue about how to get there, and Apple famously did. They absolutely famously argued about how to get to the next stage, but they didn't argue with the vision. The vision was
Mm.
to kind of create a completely new ecosystem of products. Well, exactly how that happened, you can read biographies of Steve Jobs and his team. They argued furiously about how to do that. That's okay. But there was
Mhm.
no doubt that they wanted the iPod, the iPhone, the iPad, the watch, all of those innovations. Like, hey, that's what we're going for. Let's figure out how to get there together. And it can be done. There's so many great examples. And that's what gives me hope for not just the United States, but, pandemics, things, supply chain shortages are opportunities for organizations to rethink their business models. You know,
Mhm.
think about the example of Uber. In the United States, when I remember speaking with a few business colleagues as the pandemic was starting, and I thought, okay, Uber, Lyft, those kind of rideshare services, they're done. There's just no way that they're going to be able to survive. And they were under a lot of stress during that time. But they redefined their business model around food delivery and package delivery. And they saw that people were staying in their homes and they were getting things delivered. and they still wanted to eat out. They still wanted all the things they could get. And how could they rethink their business model to deliver food and deliver goods to people instead of carrying people around? And
Mm-hmm.
they so there are opportunities right now. And that's what I would say to entrepreneurs and people who are looking at this right now and thinking, oh, it's just such a mess. A mess creates opportunity.
Absolutely. And what a great thing to end today's show on is that there is, in times of adversity, in times of challenge, in times of when things don't feel quite right, those are those moments that are calling for those of you that are, visionary, that have those leadership qualities. It's they're actually calling to you to step forward, to stand up and take a really good look and start being the disruptor and the innovator. Like now the things are disruptive, go in there and start looking at things and how can I innovate on this and what do I do next? And what's interesting about this whole thing is that this is cyclical, right? There's cycles with this. So we're through we've got a whole lot of disruptors in governments all over the world right now. There's going to come a time where the new person is going to will step forward. We're looking for, we hope there'll be someone that's got great vision, awesome leadership that, as you say, that we can get behind and really trust in our governments and in our powers that be again. And I think that's really something that is being called for and being called for fast. So I've thoroughly enjoyed today's conversation. I want to let everybody know where to go and get a copy of your book. It's in Amazon, so you can go to Amazon and download it. You can also go and grab it, grab the audio version, which is what I did, and I've enjoyed listening to that copy. And where else can people get more of you, Jace? Where's the best place for them to be able to hang out with you?
The best place to find more information out about the book and find ways to get in touch with me is at marketerinchief.com. That website has all of the links to the different books. You can go to Amazon. You can go to Amazon wherever you are in the world. It's available anywhere. So make sure to go check that out or find me on LinkedIn. The wonderful thing about having a name like Jason Voiovich is that you're not going to find a whole lot of others. So if you find that name, you have found me. Just say, hey, I heard you on Tracy Wilson's show. Let's connect. Let's talk about it a little bit more. Awesome. That's a very easy way to get in touch with me. So check it out. I think you'll really enjoy it. I think it's history, yes, but it's all about how history relates to what you're facing right now. And I think that's what's valuable about the book. That's why I wrote it.
And it absolutely is. I must admit, when you first sent it to me and I'm like, oh, am I going to go down the path of reading American history? Being somebody that's not American, here we go. But I've thoroughly enjoyed it. It's been a very interesting, the way that you've put it together, the way that you're looking at things is definitely from an entrepreneurial or business perspective. So if you are somebody who is really, you're looking for something a little bit different, you're wanting to become an entrepreneur, you're wanting to create your own business, or maybe you've got one right now and you're wanting to kind of understand what opportunities exist, go and have a little look at the book that Jason has written, and you can start to study some of these presidents just like he has to understand what opportunities exist for you. One that I want to point out, so for some of you that are kind of in this space of COVID-19 and what's going on with with the world right now, go back and actually have a look, read his book, but maybe you also want to do a little bit of research on Woodrow Wilson, who was president way back in the 1918s, and that was he was a president when the pandemic when the last pandemic was around, and he was trying to do some stuff around war mobilization and COVID. And there's some correlations that Jace that you'll see between what's going on with COVID-19 right now and not necessarily the disease itself, as Jace says, but it's more about the communication that's surrounding it. So go and have a little looky at that. You might find that fascinating, as I will be delving a little bit deeper into that too. So thank you so much for being a wonderful guest today and sharing your knowledge, your expertise, and your skills on today's Unlocked show. As you guys know, I'm Tracy Wilson. It's been my pleasure to be your host today, and we've had a wonderful guest with us, Jason Voiovich, who has shared his expertise. And make sure that you head on over to marketerandcheif.com, and you'll be able to get more of Jace if you were interested in this particular subject matter. So thanks very much, and I'll see you guys again on another episode of The Unlocked Show with me, your host, Tracy Wilson, next week, Wednesday, 10 a.m. Brisbane time. Thanks very much, Jace. I'll see you again soon.
Thank you, Tracy. Thank you for having me on.
You're very welcome. Thanks, everybody. Have a great week, and we'll see you again soon.